What we're going to do now is move on to using the competitive market model to understand how some sort of external shock to a marketplace might affect consumers and producers. This is known as the study of welfare economics. This material draws on Chapter 9 from the textbook. Before we do this, I want to give you a bit of a bigger picture idea. The competitive model gives you the tools that you need to understand how there might be changes in demand or supply and how those changes then affect equilibrium quantities and prices. What we don't know is how, when there's a change in equilibrium quantities or prices, is who loses and who gains from those changes. In particular, does a shock to a market model, for instance, an increase in demand or a decrease in supply, does that impact producers and consumers in a positive way or a negative way? What we're really trying to get at is when there's a change, who gains and by how much, and who loses and by how much. Now, to do that, we rely on what's called welfare economics. And despite the name, it actually has a very specific meaning that you might not quite grasp at this point. When we talk about, and when I say we, I mean economists, when economists talk about welfare economics, what they're really doing is talking about the analysis of the impact of a change on various groups' well-being. It's not about government payments to the poor. So when an economist talks about welfare economics and an economic analysis of the welfare consequences associated with a change, we're not talking about government payments to people who are living below the poverty line, for instance. Now, before we do that, I want to say a few words about why we might see government involvement in a marketplace. Because typically when economists use welfare economics to understand the impact of some kind of a shock, it's done in the context of government intervening in the marketplace. And we see governments intervening in marketplaces from time to time, and it's usually for a good reason. In particular, government intervention in a marketplace is justified when markets fail to work. When that happens, we call it a market failure. Now, market failures occur in a number of different circumstances. One is when there isn't a market present for a good or a service. For instance, we don't have a market for air or for groundwater or surface water or for food safety. In the absence of a market for those goods, it's difficult to try to establish a price for those goods, and it's difficult to try to sell them or to buy them. In those instances, government can sometimes intervene and actually take action designed to improve the quality of air or water or enhance food safety. We also see market failure when there's monopoly control, more broadly when there's what we call market power. And the idea here is that a producer or a consumer is so large relative to the overall size of the market that they can control the price that they pay or they receive. When that happens, price signals become very distorted, and consumers and producers make decisions that aren't in their own best interest. Now, when that occurs, we often talk about a market failure happening, and governments sometimes intervene by breaking up the monopoly or trying to take action against firms that maybe have market power. Another time we see market failure is when people don't have full information, in particular when there's risk or when there's what we call asymmetric information. What's going on here is that when there's two people engaged in a negotiation, if one person has more information than the other, we have asymmetric information, and there's potential for market power to be exerted. Now, there's different types and ways that governments can intervene in a marketplace. It's also important to recognize that government provides many important functions in place of the private sector doing so. And so these are examples of instances where you've got government involvement, but it's not necessarily in a marketplace, but it's in the provision of goods or services that the market won't necessarily provide. So for instance, provision of law and order is done under the auspices of governments in the form of police or justice systems because, frankly, there isn't a market for these types of services that doesn't necessarily lead to unwanted consequences. National defense and infrastructure are also examples where government provides important functions that aren't necessarily amenable to being provided through the marketplace. Now, infrastructure is a bit of a gray area because we do have circumstances such as toll roads where the private sector has worked its way into the marketplace and is providing a service in the absence of the government doing so. We also see government involvement through economic and social regulations that tries to encourage competition or establishes the rules and institutions that govern transactions through contract law or through the provisions of things like weights and measures that standardizes what we consider to be a kilogram or the provision of standards through grades that make it easier to transact. With respect to the agri-food sector, there's a number of rationales for government intervention in the marketplace. One rationale is that governments intervene in the agri-food sector as a means of supporting or protecting an infant industry. Another argument that often gets made is that government involvement in the agri-food sector is done to curb market power held by firms that maybe distort price signals and make it disadvantageous for agricultural producers to earn a living. Another argument is that governments intervene as a means of providing for food security. And what I mean by food security is that we're talking about food self-sufficiency as opposed to a food safety argument. Consumer health and safety issues are also used as the rationale for government intervention in the agri-food sector, as well as environmental quality. And we'll talk some more about these in class in the next couple of days to try to understand particular examples of where governments have intervened and what they do and how they do that. One emerging issue that has been used as related to government involvement in the non-farm segment of the food sector, that is in the food processing sector, has to do with adequate and cheap food supply. We know that hunger is a serious problem for some in North America. Indeed, starvation and hunger are not necessarily problems that are unique to the developing world. There's many in Canada who go without meals and who are hungry. And in those circumstances, food assistance programs can become very important. Typically, those food assistance programs have some government involvement or some government backing. Government involvement in the non-farm sector in rural communities is also important because such involvement often facilitates economic growth and provides health and education services that otherwise wouldn't be provided to rural communities. Within the food sector, we can think of examples of where governments intervene with respect to issues like nutrition and health. Again, this goes back to notions of food safety and sanitary requirements, the establishments of grades and standards that make it easier to transact in a contract, as well as labeling requirements. So a good example of that is the requirement that food have French and English packaging in Canada. As well, we see labeling requirements related to ingredients that are designed to ensure that people who might have food allergies don't consume something that could cause them a bad health effect. Other labeling requirements that we see are health claims that governments require, in particular claims or regulations that say you can't say certain things or you're allowed to say only some things. We also see government involvement in the food industry through health and nutrition recommendations, and what I'm talking about here is Canada's Food Guide, and also with respect to taxation on things that people perhaps think aren't necessarily good things to consume. So we have very high excise taxes on alcoholic beverages, and there have been calls by some to put in place taxes on snack food or food that have high caloric and high energy density relative to the price, as well as food away from home. Now, I don't want to talk about the rationale for government intervention that much in the video. We can talk about it in class. What I want to do is actually get down to how we measure economic benefits accruing to consumers and producers in a marketplace. We're going to start with consumers. And when we do this, we talk about consumer welfare. And consumer welfare from a good is the benefit the consumer gets from consuming that good minus what the consumer paid to buy the good. So it's basically trying to value what that good is worth to you as a consumer and then deducting what you had to pay for the good. And in fact, the demand curve helps us do this because the demand curve contains the information on how much more a consumer would have been willing to pay for a good than they actually paid. And what the demand curve actually represents is what we call a marginal willingness to pay. It shows the maximum amount a consumer will spend for an extra unit of the good. And the difference between that marginal willingness to pay and price that the consumer actually paid is the benefit that they receive for that extra unit of the good. We can illustrate consumer willingness to pay and consumer welfare using a demand diagram. So in this diagram, I've drawn a downward sloping demand curve that reflects the law of demand. We've got quantity on the x-axis and price on the y-axis. And let's just suppose for the sake of argument that the equilibrium price for this good is $6 per unit. We know that if the consumer faces that price of $6 per unit, that their optimal level of consumption would be 5 units of the good. Now, what's important to recognize is while the consumer may consume 5 units of the good in total, they'll actually consume 1 unit of the good, then a second unit of the good, then a third unit of the good, then a fourth unit of the good, and then that final 5th unit of the good. When they consume 1 unit of good, we can actually calculate their marginal willingness to pay where the dashed line coming up from quantity equals 1 intersects with the demand curve. That happens at $10. So that first good that the consumer has consumed has given them a marginal willingness to pay of $10. They would be willing to pay up to $10 to consume that first unit. But they only had to pay $6. So that means they've got a surplus left over. They'd be willing to pay 10, but they only paid 6. And so the difference is the $4 between the 10 and the 6. I've highlighted that with this red line. That shows how much additional benefits that they got from consuming that first good. When they consume the second unit of the good, their marginal willingness to pay is going to fall. And that simply reflects the law of demand. And in this particular example, we're going to say that it falls to $9. But again, they would have been willing to pay $9, but they only had to pay $6, and so they have some additional benefits that they've realized. In particular, that second unit of the good leads to a surplus of consumer welfare equal to $3. When they move to 3 units of consumption, they'd again still have a marginal willingness to pay. That is going to be above the price. In this case, it's going to be $8, and they've again got some additional benefits that they would have realized through consumption. They would have been willing to pay up to $8 to consume that third unit of the good, but they only had to pay $6, and so they have some excess benefits, some surplus economic benefits that are also measured with this vertical red line. And when they move to 4 units of consumption, their marginal willingness to pay is still above the price, but it has fallen, and now it's going to be $7. And from that 4th unit of the good, we know that they're going to have some surplus economic benefits equal to the difference between their marginal willingness to pay and the price that they actually paid, illustrated with this shorter red line. Now, we can actually be much more precise than trying to measure the economic benefits realized through consumption as the difference between a particular point on the demand curve and the price that the consumer actually pays. So let's just suppose that instead of having discrete units of consumption, that is consumption that's measured on 1 unit, 2 units, 3 units, and 4 units, we had fractions of consumption that could occur. So you could consume a unit and a half, or for instance, a kilogram and a half. Well, if we did that, we could still go through that thought experiment of measuring the difference between the marginal willingness to pay and the price that the consumer actually paid, and add up all of those differences to get at what we call consumer surplus. This is our measure of consumer well-being. In the diagram that's up on the screen right now, that consumer surplus, that is the additional economic benefits the consumer receives from consumption above the price that they had to pay, is equal to the triangle ABC. And we call that, as I just said, consumer surplus. And we call it a surplus because it's the surplus benefits that are left over after the consumer pays the price that the market requires them to pay in order to consume. So area ABC in that diagram is a measure of the excess the consumer was willing to pay to consume 5 units of the product. And we, as I said, we call that a consumer surplus. It's simply the monetary difference between what the consumer was willing to pay for a product and what the consumer had to pay for a product as they consume consecutive units of consumption. Now, we can actually calculate this value. And in fact, in some of the policy work that I do, I spend a lot of my time trying to measure consumer surplus. It can be a complicated calculation, but it can also be made easier. When you have a linear demand equation like we've been dealing with, you can determine consumer surplus geometrically as the area below the demand curve but above the equilibrium price. That area is actually really easy to calculate. It's simply the area of a triangle. So when you have a linear demand equation, consumer surplus is going to equal 1/2 the base of the triangle times the height of the triangle. Well, the base of the triangle will be the quantity consumed, and the height of the triangle will be the intercept along the price axis minus the equilibrium price. In the example that we've been dealing with, that's going to end up leading to a calculation of 1/2 times 5, which is the quantity consumed, times 11 minus 6. Remember, 11 was the intercept of that demand equation, and 6 was the price that the consumer faced. And if we work through the math, what we would find is that consumer surplus in this circumstance is $12.50. And so it's a measure of the monetary amount of benefits that the consumer gets above the price that they had to pay. Now, one thing that's important here is to recognize that if you change the position of the supply curve, then you're going to have a different equilibrium price, and that's going to change consumer surplus. So for instance, if you imagine the supply curve shifting downwards, the equilibrium price will fall, and then consumer surplus is going to increase. And this makes some intuitive sense. Consumers like prices to be low, so if the price falls, that should make them better off. And if they're better off, what we should see is an increase in their welfare. And that means we should see an increase in consumer surplus. So for instance, if price fell to $5 per unit, demand would rise to 6 units, and the consumer surplus would then be calculated as 1/2 times 6, which is the units of consumption, times 11 minus 5, which gives us consumer surplus equal to $18. So consumer surplus has risen. We can illustrate that using this diagram where we've got our initial equilibrium price of $6 and initial consumer surplus of ABC. When the price falls to $5 per unit, consumption will rise to 6, and we see an increase in consumer surplus equal to the geometric area bounded by A in this corner, C here, D here, or sorry, E here, and D here. So we're now able to calculate the change in consumer surplus arising from some price increase or decrease. Now, let's think about this for a minute in the context of our pork example. We knew that initially the price that the consumer faced was $3.30 per kilogram, and that led to consumption of 220 million kilograms of pork per year. So before any kind of shock to the marketplace, we could calculate consumer surplus as 1/2 times the quantity consumed, that's the base of the triangle, times the height of the triangle, which is going to be $14.30 minus $3.30, and that will give us an equilibrium or a consumer surplus in this initial equilibrium of $1.2 billion. So when I show this as $1,210, that's actually stated in millions, and so we've got a fairly large consumer surplus. Now let's just suppose for the sake of argument that prices rise to $4 per kilogram. We know that when price rises to $4 per kilogram, that consumption will fall. In this particular instance, you could calculate the new equilibrium quantity as 206 million kilograms of pork. In this instance, we could calculate consumer surplus after that price change as simply 1/2 times the base of the surplus triangle, that is 1/2 times 206, times the height of the surplus triangle, which is going to be 14.3, which is the intercept on the price axis, minus the new price of $4, and that's going to give us a consumer surplus of $1.06 billion. And so we know now that after that price increase that consumers are made worse off because of it. Their surplus is now lower. Now, there's all sorts of neat things that can be said about consumer surplus, but I want to focus on a couple of them. And one is a little bit confusing when we first start to talk about it, but I'm going to go through this relatively slowly and then also have a diagram to try to illustrate the intuition behind it. In general, as the price increases, consumer surplus will fall by a larger amount, first in a case where the consumer has spent more on the good. That is, the greater the expenditure or the further to the right the consumer is on the demand curve. In addition, we would see a price increase leading to larger changes in consumer surplus when demand is less inelastic. That is, the more vertical or the steeper the demand curve, the less willing consumers are to give up the good, and some consumers do not cut their consumption as much, and their surplus reflects that. Now, these aren't necessarily that entirely clear or intuitively obvious, so let's look at some diagrams to illustrate both cases. So let's look at the first instance where we're concerned with where the consumer's positioned along the demand curve initially. And let's suppose that we've got some consumer at P0 and Q0. The point here is the more the consumer has spent on the good, the further to the right the consumer is on the demand curve, and the larger the reduction in the surplus when the price rises. So for instance, if we have a consumer who's initially consuming Q0 at price P0, and then price rises to P0 plus $5, then we know that their consumption will fall and that the change in their consumer surplus will be this red shaded area. Now, that's a fairly large area, and in fact, if the price rose by another $5, their consumption will fall and the change in their surplus will actually be smaller. So let's show that by raising price by another $5 to P0 plus $10. We know that quantity is going to fall to Q2, and that the change in consumer surplus will equal this yellow shaded area. The point of this is that the further the consumer is to the right on the demand curve, the larger the change associated with the larger the change in consumer surplus associated with the change in price. If price goes up by $5, we're initially going to see this very large reduction in consumer surplus. If it goes up by a further $5, we'll still see a reduction in consumer surplus, only now it's going to be by a smaller amount. The second point can be illustrated with this diagram on the right. I've got two demand curves drawn down here, one for different kinds of consumers. For one kind of consumer, their demand is very inelastic or very steep, and for the other consumer, demand is very elastic or rather shallow. And the point of this is that the less elastic the demand curve, then we know the steeper it's going to be. And when we have a very steep demand curve or an inelastic demand curve, then the less willing consumers are going to be to give up the good when the price rises. They're not terribly price sensitive. That leads to a larger reduction in consumer surplus for those with inelastic demand. Let's illustrate this on the right by supposing price rises from P0 to P1. We know that when that happens, quantity demanded is going to fall. But by how much quantity demanded falls is going to depend on whether or not we have an elastic or an inelastic demand curve. If we have an elastic demand curve, there's going to be a very large reduction in quantity demanded from Q0 to Q1E. When we have an inelastic demand curve, the change in quantity demanded is going to be smaller, and it's going to be equal to something equivalent to Q1IE to Q0. Now, important in this is that we can measure the welfare consequences associated with the change in the price for consumers who have elastic demand and inelastic demand, and that they won't be the same. If we measure the change in consumer surplus arising from the price change for the elastic consumer, what we would see is that the change in their surplus is equal to this yellow area. If we do the same thing for the consumer with the inelastic demand curve, what we would see is that the change in their consumer surplus would equal this yellow area plus this red area. So for those consumers who are inelastic with respect to the good, that is, if their demand is not very sensitive to the price of the good, we see a larger reduction in consumer surplus. And this just reflects the fact that they are not willing to give up the quantity of consumption that they have, and that they're willing to give up some consumer surplus in order to maintain their level of consumption. We can also talk about economic benefits for producers. And here we talk about producer surplus. And producer surplus is simply the economic return above the firm's variable cost of production. It's the difference between the amount for which a good sells and the minimum price necessary for the seller to be willing to produce that good. We can illustrate that with this diagram, and it's actually a very simple concept. So let's suppose that the price that this producer receives and takes is equal to $4. If the firm is facing that price of $4, the economically optimal thing for them to do would be to produce 3 units of the good. Now, what's important to recognize is in the process of producing and selling those 3 units of the good, they're also going to sell 1 unit of the good and 2 units of the good. We know that if they're going to produce 1 unit of the good, that we can read their marginal cost of production for that first unit of the good off of the supply curve. In this case, it's going to be $2. What we use as the measure of producer surplus is the difference between the price the producer receives and their marginal cost of production associated with that unit of production. In this case, it's going to be the difference between 4 and 2. So for that first unit of the good, the firm is receiving $2 in economic surplus. When they go to produce the second unit of the good, we can read their marginal cost off that supply curve as well, and it's going to be $3. So their marginal cost of production is $3, but they receive a price of $2, and so their benefits associated with that second good of production is equal to 4 minus 3, or $1. And so we could do this for different quantities between 0 and 3 and measure the area that would tell us what producer surplus equals. In this case, producer surplus would be equal to the area ABC. That is the area below the price but above the supply curve. Now, we could calculate that using math, but in this particular case, it's actually quite easy to calculate that using geometry because it's simply the area of a triangle. And so what we would do is calculate producer surplus as 1/2 times the base of the triangle times the height of the triangle. In this case, that's 1/2 times the quantity supplied times the price minus the intercept on the price axis. So for this particular example, that would be 1/2 times 3 times 4 minus 1, or $4.50. Now recognize too that if the demand curve shifts out, the equilibrium price will rise, and then that would increase producer surplus. So for instance, if the demand curve shifts out and the equilibrium price rose to $6 per unit, the quantity supplied would rise to 5 units, and the producer surplus would then be calculated as 1/2 times the base of the triangle, which would be 5 units of production, times the price minus the intercept of the supply curve, and that would lead to producer surplus of $12.50. And so producer surplus has risen. We can illustrate that with this diagram by showing the area of producer surplus when price has risen to $6 and quantity supplied is equal to 5 units. Producer surplus is measured as the area E, D, and C. Now, what's also important is that if the demand curve shifts in, the equilibrium price would fall, and if the equilibrium price falls, producer surplus would also fall. Now, we can put these two pieces of the puzzle together because when we're concerned with what's going on at a market level, we're concerned both about producers and consumers. Now, this also means we're concerned with their welfare, their economic welfare. And so when economists look at the impact of markets, they don't just look at the impact on consumer surplus and producer surplus. They also look at what's called total economic surplus. And total economic surplus is simply consumer surplus plus producer surplus. So consumer surplus is the area below the demand curve and above the market price, and producer surplus is the area above the supply curve but below the market price. And those two areas together represent the economic well-being achieved by all market participants in a given market. We can illustrate this graphically by showing consumer surplus as the triangle that's below the demand curve but above the equilibrium price, and producer surplus as the triangle that's below price but above the supply curve. Now, one thing that's important to recognize is that if there's any change in the supply or the demand curve, that both producer and or consumer surplus are going to change, and so too will total economic surplus. This is a good place to stop. What we're going to do in class over the next few days is actually illustrate how we can calculate producer and consumer surplus and social surplus in a variety of circumstances, and illustrate some cases where we can actually use it to understand the economic consequences associated with policies such as supply management policies in Canada.